Welcome to Colourful, a podcast where we explore how race shapes our experiences. I'm Stacey Jane, a white woman and mom of two living in Cape Town, looking to challenge the systems of privilege.
And I'm Sena, a black woman living in Johannesburg, passionate about interrogating power dynamics and the intersection of identity. Our vision is to spark candid and open dialogue for a more inclusive South Africa.
As you know by now, we are not afraid to have uncomfortable conversations because we believe that complacency perpetuates injustice.
And as you also know, we aim to bridge divides through empathy and understanding. You know that sometimes we laugh, sometimes we cry, but at least we're doing it together. So welcome to Colourful.
Sena, I am super excited. Today is a special episode for us because we are collaborating with Kantar, which is the world's largest consumer research agency, via their Culture, Race and Ethnicity in the Workplace group, known as CREW.
Yes, Stacey. In fact, at our Colourful official launch 2 weeks ago, we spoke about how tough we found it to get engaging just like with companies and brands and getting sponsorships because although a lot of them may agree that these discussions are very important, they still feel it's too risky to take a stand and support these discussions. So I think Kantar and CREW deserve a massive shout out for their bravery and taking a stand and, willing to co-sign these conversations.
And if that wasn't enough, today's episode is even more special because we are hosting this episode in honor of National Heritage Day here in South Africa. So this day holds so much significance because it acknowledges and celebrates the diversity of our cultural heritage as a country. And of course, culture and heritage, as you would imagine, are inextricably
Stacey, we always joke about this. You're most likely to create a new word.
That is true. Culture and race are inextricably linked with the skin that we inhabit. So race will be the underlying factor in the discussions that we have here today.
Yes, and to help us unpack it all, we are joined by an incredible guest. We are joined in the Colourful studio by a formidable advocate of diversity who has made her mark globally. Her diverse portfolio includes a legal background, an international modeling career, and impactful work as an activist, which has led to contributions to United Nations policy discussions around albinism. She is the first Black South African to ever be featured in the prestigious Braai calendar, photographed for its 2018 edition. And throughout, she has consistently promoted inclusion, diversity, and representation. She was also listed as one of BBC's top 100 inspirational and influential women across the globe and made history as the first woman with albinism to grace the cover of Vogue Portugal in their April 2019 issue. Welcome to the phenomenal Thando Hopa.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start off with getting to know you better. I mean, after reading that prolific bio, I feel like I need to take a little bit of a breath. But could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and tell us about your background, tell us about you and a little bit about your culture and heritage and what that means to you on a personal level?
Okay, so I grew up in Lenasia South. And actually at that time, we were somewhat moving out of apartheid. So we were still quite segregated communities. And Lenasia South was designated and categorized as an Indian community. So when I got there, it was actually quite interesting because it allowed me to absorb a lot of multicultural experiences because you get some, forms of religion from the Hindi community, from Islam and Christianity. All of it was just, But we were a minority as a Black family there. And I was a minority also because it was a community that was far more pigmented than I was. So that kind of brought in those very interesting experiences. But before, that kind of becomes relevant, one of the things that I grew up with that was very precious to me, it's sort of twofold. Now, I'm Xhosa, and half of me is Mosotho. And my grandmother, as a Mosotho woman, used to sing me these lullabies. And it was this way of giving me all these stories about the Basotho people, but in a playful manner. And it is something that now, as a mother, I realized how rich what she was giving me is because I'm now trying to pass it on to my child. And then my father, my Xhosa is terrible, by the way. It's very pedestrian. My Sotho is fine, but my Xhosa is terrible. And my father, what he would do is he would say to me, whenever he would say to me, Ungumamni, it would be like, basically it's almost like invoke your lineage, invoke your ancestry. And I would say, "Ningumamngwevu, ningumasikhomo, Makgudulu, Mhlatyana," and all of that, basically, it'll tell you what your lineage is and the stories that are related to that lineage. So I think those were parts of my upbringing that were absolutely beautiful. And we were a singing household. A lot of the times we sang indigenous songs, and it's an art that I feel is getting some level of erasure in the culture. But yeah, that was, apart from the drama of having albinism, that was my that was my upbringing.
So yeah, and just listening to you and about how you grew up, and then obviously having followed some of your career internationally, you have such a rich and diverse cultural background, both as you've just described where you started, but then as becoming a global citizen. So how do you navigate that duality of maintaining your culture and heritage here in South Africa, and then kind of being exposed to the globe and understanding the pressures that would be required of you to, is the word assimilate, or to fit in within the global scale?
I think one of the things is, and I don't know if this is particularly the most holistic answer I can give, but when you go into a global space, what I have taught is I've used media as the space of negotiation. It's a negotiating medium in order for people to have access to ideas they normally would not have access to. And in this space, I remember that even when I did Vogue, there was a very strong propensity to have a North African feel, which was fine. It was beautiful. I'm also African. It's all part of me. But as the more you move to Southern Africa, we're very green people, etc., just in terms of land. And I remember that I decided to take some of, there's a part where I'm wearing my mother's necklace and Zulu earrings so I kind of did my best when I could to kind of bring certain parts of my identity, because I'm all of these, aspects. I am this in this way, like Xhosa, I am that aspect, and I am a career woman, and I'm all of that stuff. But I think I am in that space where I use media to kind of bring those parts of myself, whether I'm having my braids as a woman, or you just bring in those parts that celebrate your cultural identity. But I do think that, from travel, I think that South Africans need to allow themselves for it to be regularized in our daily lives. When you travel, people wear their heritage attire, if you can put it that way, to work all the time. It is not an event. It is not a 24th of September type of thing, They go and they will wear whatever, whether it's a kente or a kitenge or whatever the material is. It's regularized in the culture. And I do think that something within our power dynamics has not made that regular. And I think it's something we need to introspect on.
What an interesting point that you've made, and something that Sena and I have chatted about in the context of the celebration of Heritage Day, which it can be quite frustrating, because there's this growing trend towards people referring to this significant day not as Heritage Day, but as something called Braai Day, where people stand around the braai in their rugby jerseys, and it feels like that really overshadows the purpose of having a Heritage Day. And so how do you, within the context of what you just described, how do you think it is that we can use this day to signify all cultures in a way that is respectful to all cultures?
I think that is actually what we had been doing. I'm not really sure. I don't really understand what the Bright Day thing was all about, to be quite honest, because I think that's what we had segmented Heritage Day to be. But I think one of the things is that I do think we need to move away from the space of it being permissive for us to show our cultures. as opposed to it's somewhat being required for us to understand that we have diversity within our nations. And something like Pride Day, I don't really understand what the purpose was for it, because you never want to, if there is a word called deculturalize, Indigenous people experience so many layers of erasure. Any Indigenous community is always fighting against the concept of vanishing. And I think we have to be very, very sensitive and considerate about the history that we have, and that vanishing is absolutely not an option. So whenever we have this propensity to try and sort of make ourselves overly homogenous when we're not, I think that we need to move away from that, from that propensity. I think we need to move away from it. Instead, more than anything, we need to be unearthing, rediscovering, going through the sense of ideological repatriation, where we kind of reclaim all of these ways of life. Because Indigenous people have ways of life, expressions, imaginations, and you can't let all of that life die. So I think you always have to do it institutionally, structurally. You need to make sure that you preserve, maintain, and make sure that all of these ways of life, they thrive, as opposed to restrict.
I think it goes down to, you echoed my sentiments. A big frustration for me about Heritage Day is it's the one day where I feel like ukuvunula is now co-signed and I can do it. And then it almost becomes this costume. And you touched on that, there needs to be a repatriation of ideology from people of color, from culture, embracing that. And I agree with that. And that's against a backdrop, though, of systems and power dynamics that have been designed to eat away at culture and erase. So I guess my question is that it's so complex, and I get that it also comes from a place of inner healing. How can we begin to do that healing and then properly call out the structures that are still actively, like, if I make an example of showing up in the workplace in traditional attire, there is a workplace policy somewhere that would not permit that. So how do we balance that across against a world that seems so determined to mute out indigenous ethnic cultures and just indigenous cultures all over the world? It's not just South Africa. There's examples in Canada, Australia.
I think, you know what, this is always twofold. There's the individual, and then there's almost this outer layer, which is, your structural, institutional, etc. And when you talk about systems, it's an input, a process, and an output. Inputs, that is mainly legislation. Another, form of input would be media, and then it goes through the process, and then you have to look at your output. So if people are giving you resistance and saying that you are diminishing our culture, I think especially when you're in leadership, in any form of leadership, more than being, sensitive about this, just look at the system and then look at the feedback. All of it is just feedback. What people are telling you, it's feedback. It's telling you about the design. And you have to go back and almost look at it more analytically. You have to look at it as a process of redesign. Say, all right, in our inputs, what in our legislation, in our media, in our education, what did we do to bring about this output? Because the feedback will tell you, it will measure the output for you. So, this is like the first thing. Now, in an individual sense, I do think that we need to kind of get to a space where we allow ourselves to be so curious about ourselves as Africans, like find out more about the things that you were once told you never had. Things like writing, things like art, things like, or just all of these beadwork, because beadwork requires a level of mathematics. All of these things have the sense of inner curiosity and also have the sense of just showing up. Because the thing is, if I show up in Sishweshwe, I don't only show up in Sishweshwe, I also feed the entire ecosystem and value chain of Sishweshwe. Culture is connected to economics. So the more you bring about all of these things, whether the Ghanaians show you the kente, etc., it feeds into the textile industry, manufacturing, it feeds into agriculture, cotton, it feeds into that entire ecosystem. So we need to see it as this circular system, ecosystem that we are building into. It's not just dressing up and looking, in the sense with heritage. It is also you're building into the ecosystem. So I think that we do have to have, as you talk about systems, we need to have that consciousness that what we put into the culture is not just what you see, it actually results in economy.
I love that. That was such a beautiful challenge and description. It actually leads me a little bit to my next question, which is around, there's this long-standing global debate about the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. And I feel like what you were describing now was a lot about appreciation. But before we go there, can you kind of describe to us your understanding of the difference of both? And then how do we engage with one another's culture in an appreciation way rather than an appropriation way?
Sure, that is a difficult question. And some countries actually legislate against using certain elements of their heritage. Because one of the things people tend to be worried about is that things lose a sense of location. Now, if you just take something and maybe let's just say you say, oh, this is African, and you don't say it's from Ghana, you don't say it's from South Africa, you don't say it's from Burkina Faso, that lack of location and lack of reference makes that place and region lose the economy of that thing, right? Because then it can go anywhere. It goes anywhere. And then those people whose imagination have brought this about no longer have an economic benefit to this thing. And they cannot exploit this economically, yet it came from the imagination and the DNA of their ancestors. So I think one of the issues is location, is that with cultural appropriation, it makes whatever art or expressions there are to lose that sense of location. And whether sometimes it's country location, sometimes it's race location, whatever the case may be. And then another thing I think with cultural appropriation is that generally there is a power dynamic at play. I do think that, sharing ideas and sharing imaginations, and because we've had trade all of our lives, it's part of human history. And through trade, there is a sense of also not just trading items, but trading innovation and trading ideas. That's why you will see that Basotho have that vector hat, but you will also find it in Indonesia. And so you see this level of trade and exchange, but there is a level of reciprocity as opposed to a level of exploitation and extraction. And I think whenever there is a power dynamic, there is politics, because politics is about power. Whenever there's a power dynamic, a lot of the times how that system will behave, it'll be a system that extracts and exploits while underdeveloping the people it takes from, So I think that's the issue with cultural appropriation. That's how I would see cultural appropriation. Cultural appreciation, as I said, I think that it is when the power dynamic is alleviated. It is a time where the sharing of ideas has the sense of reciprocal benefit. But I think more than anything, it's a question of power.
And I must say that as a white woman, this is something that I consider and struggle with at the same time, is the difference between appreciation and appropriation. And your answer has kind of guided me a little bit in the direction of, let's say it is National Heritage Day, and I want to show up in traditional attire to work. I don't really have much that I can wear, but perhaps I want to show the fact that I am South African, and if I choose to wear if I choose to wear something that reflects being South African, I need to be aware of the location that ties that attire to how I'm showing up. There is a difference between showing up in attire that is isiZulu versus isiXhosa. and I need to know the difference. I can't just show up in all the
Right,
beads and just expect that I'm looking African. And
right,
it's my job,
right.
given the power dynamics that you spoke about, to
Right,
understand that. And there, it probably
right.
moves away from appropriation to appreciation.
Also, it just going back to location, it does go back to if you say that this belongs to Amaxhosa and you reference it, it is easier for there to be economic investment, cultural investment in whatever you're showing, you know. So that's why I think location is very important because it helps investment, economic investment, come and pour into those communities. But if you don't give it a location, then it's almost in a way it starts extracting out of that community. So yeah, I think location is important.
And it takes me
Mm,
to something, it's a little bit triggering, not a little bit, it's massively
mm,
triggering.
mm,
And I can't count the amount of times I felt triggered by a white woman showing up in braids, knowing very well that I've been
mm,
like really stigmatized throughout my life because of my hair,
mm.
with
Right,
no
right,
consideration of the history and the
right.
pain behind that, right? And I think it comes down
Mm,
to a lot of what I think the pain and sort of the trauma around so much of how our cultural erasure of minority or indigenous groups,
mm,
um, there's a painful
mm,
history behind that. And
mm,
I've seen, depending globally, how it goes with different indigenous communities. They seek to go
mm,
away as far away from that pain as possible because you sort of want to
mm,
dissociate
mm,
from it. How can
mm,
we,
mm,
as marginalized communities and indigenous communities, hold space to acknowledge the painful histories that have sort of
mm,
come to define parts of us, not all of us, but parts
mm,
of us,
mm,
while also
mm.
making space to move forward and celebrate?
Um, it goes back to I think we have to be very considered about what our inputs are. Because the thing is that with everything, every kind of intervention that has some kind of social impact, it almost has 100-year range, you know. When the first person, I think when one of the, I say the fathers of race stratification, was Johann Blumenbach. I think he was a German man. And when he started doing the race stratification, although he thought, the people who were from actually it was skull stratification, which was quite interesting. And the Caucasian skull initially was just it was features, not particularly a race. It was just features that looked like people who were in the Caucasus Mountains. And then he created all of these skulls, and then created sort of the concepts of race. But he had no idea at the time how this idea would develop and end up having a real impact and sort of economic investment that started devastating nations. He didn't know that, right? And I think for me, it was just such a very interesting lesson in history. And I want to give you a very tangent example. I think it was around the 1920s when a particular shaving brand, women were beginning to work, etc. And now you started seeing them in their work attire, you started seeing hair on their legs, and you started seeing hair on their armpits. And, in this entire thing, they thought, okay, we were not used to actually seeing, because women were generally in their homes, and you weren't seeing all this body hair, even though people knew that women have body hair. So they started doing these ad campaigns to show that, this is somewhat objectionable for women to be looking this way. That was in the 1920s. How many women do you know who actually, despite feminism, despite all of that, how many women do you know who actually show their body hair? Because every intervention that has any kind of social impact, negative or positive, tends to have 100-year range before there's any real change that starts happening. That doesn't mean that we need to be complacent and allow everything that is negative to happen. But what it does mean is we need to almost see the changes that we put down as 100-year plan. So just even in terms of healing, I think one of the things that for me, I'll speak about myself. one of the things with cultural appropriation that I am not quite, that makes me a bit uncomfortable, is that a lot of the times these are placed in spaces of commodification by an institution that has always devalued how we looked, our art. They'll tell us we do not have art, we do not have, any form of creative expression, yet we'll take those artifacts and put them in museums and commodify them. So I think that particular conflict has been quite difficult, and I don't really know how to solve it. But we do also have to think about I don't know if you could say the exporting of our culture. We do need to be able to reel it in and commodify it for ourselves. We need to make sure that it enriches us. So there is a level of balance that we need to get through, because we can't always just hold it in. There's a level where we have to let our culture fall into the bodies of other people so that they can also sort of experience the range of cultures, but we can also find ways of building economy from that. So I think more than anything, more than worrying about sanctioning it, for lack of a better word, we need to find ways of how to create institutions to control it so that it's of economic benefit that comes back to indigenous people. So not particularly restrain it, but allow it to go out, just control where the economic resource lands.
I think that's a really, really valid point, and kind of leads us a little bit to another topic, which we obviously know you are very embedded in, which is kind of pop culture, and how it's, if you think about what pop culture is today, or let's call it modern day culture, and the way that it evolves in all of our social spaces, and it becomes the heritage for future generations. It's what our children will inherit as heritage. And so, what sort of responsibility do you feel that we have in shaping that future heritage?
I think that we need to get more invested in cultural literacy. It goes back to us being curious about ourselves. And I actually see it manifesting now. I see that people are looking at all these forms of documentation, and I'm not just talking about writing, I'm talking about hair. I'm talking about how people wrap their heads. All of these are forms of documentation. And I think that we need to be very intentional about what we archive. Because again, it goes back to every decision that you make, every form of documentation that you make, now that we have a reference of how things can be erased, we need to be intentional and understand that what we document has to have a 50 and 100-year sense of foresight. So I would say that at this point in time, all the things that we feel are useful to us in future, even in the present, we need to document them, like learn about foods, about, about hair, about textile, about different forms of writing, about different forms of storytelling. Like even when I tell you that my grandmother used to sing me these songs, they sound different from a nursery rhyme that I would sing at creche, English nursery rhyme. They have different components, different elements. There is a very interesting nursery rhyme. I don't know if I could say it's interesting. It just has a different form of storytelling. And my mother used to sing it to me, and it says, na lady ele ya mariberibe ribela ka pele re lo go nwa metsi metsi ha ayo a nwele ke kgaupe. Now the more you know about Batswana and their storytelling, you know that kgaupe is this mythological creature who used to just drink all the waters everywhere, all the water, the rains and all of that stuff. But it brings this child into this world and this imagination, and it also maybe may tell you something if you look deeper into it. Maybe Kgaupe came from a story where there was a drought or whatever the case may be, and it may tell you something about the landscape of the Batswana people. Take that, document it into the present, and then allow future generations to do what they do with it in the future. They can build up on anthropology and sociology. They can start telling stories in different ways, start telling stories having their own terms of reference, as opposed to when you learn filmmaking, you only learn filmmaking through whatever the Western lens is or whatever the Asian lens is. Look into creating your own, terms of reference. And the more you have all of this material on culture, the more you start having the sense of innovation and also developing your own terms of reference. Because people will talk about how do we build our economies? Do we look at capitalism? Do we look at socialism? Maybe look back at African societies in their own terms of reference, as their own selves, and see if you can find governance habits that are useful in the present. So it goes back to kind of this ideological repatriation. Look back to sort of improve the present. See this as a form of continuous improvement. But I do think that we just have to kind of get to the space where we're looking back, moving into the present, but also being cognizant of what we're trying to build forward. But yeah, I think it's just developing the sense of inward terms of reference.
Wow, Thando, that was so well articulated. And I think something that stood out for me as you were speaking again about, the importance of documenting and archiving. Um, so much of what we know about the world and indigenous cultures has been, there's a certain type of knowledge production that has taken place and written
Mm,
stories that have been
mm,
documented. And so that becomes what history knows. And I think a big part of
mm,
countering that is to start to produce our own thought leadership and tell our stories. And I agree
mm,
with you, the same thing with me. Most of what I know of being a Zulu woman comes from conversations with
mm,
my grandmother from the village. Unfortunately,
mm,
as I got older and had to assimilate into different cultures, those are values that I left behind. And I know that that stays with me
mm,
today. And that is a point of
mm,
sort of conflict within me. Why do you think
mm,
the values of storytelling are slowly,
mm,
which is so important to, passing down culture and heritage? Why do you think that's eroding? Is it
mm.
because we don't look at storytelling as generating thought leadership? What shift needs to happen?
Ecosystems. It goes back to ecosystems. When I grew up, there was something very simple. If you watched Spider-Man, you would also watch Spider-Man in isiZulu or isiXhosa, or you'd watch it also, in Sepedi, etc. And also you had a lot of family content in indigenous languages. So there was this form or this consciousness, interestingly enough. And it's very interesting because this was happening at a time where we were also just sort of trying to move out of apartheid, at least institutionally. It's, let me say at least legislatively, because it's South Africa is quite complex. But even then, there was there was this consciousness of finding ways of preserving storytelling. Now I have to work harder because those ecosystems are dying. And it's very difficult for me to watch family content in isiZulu and isiXhosa or isiSotho with my daughter, because some of it, this is not an issue about creative decisions. People really we should be in a space where we are totally doing everything creatively that fulfills us. But at the same time, I do feel like there isn't enough content where I could just sit down with my child so that she can learn all of these different ways of storytelling and language and all of these things. I now, in my individual capacity, have to start working much, much harder than my parents had to, because my parents had those ecosystems. They had the grandmothers, they had the television, they had all of these things that were still building into all of these ways of life and storytelling. And not just storytelling, language. Language in itself tells you story. In itself, how people communicate will tell you something about how those people think. And I'll give you an example. If you say somebody ushonile, it almost, if you listen to what the word means, it's almost like a setting of something. It isn't particularly a dying of something, it's a setting of. That's why you'll say ilanga lishonile, it's a setting. But even when a person passes, it's a setting. It's like, ilanga lishonile is a sunset. Sorry, Stacey, now I'm leaving you out of the conversation. But ilanga lishonile is a sunset. And then when somebody passes, you say ushonile. So it's almost like a setting of something. If you say in Xhosa something ndiyayicinga, and then you say in Zulu ngiyacinga, ukucinga is to look for something in Zulu. But in Xhosa, it's to think, which means you're searching for your thought. It's actually quite poetic. Language tells you story within itself. So you need to build these ecosystems where all of this learning is easy. It's not placed only within the stronghold of an individual or a mother, a parent, etc. You create the ecosystem around it. That's why I say, when I went to Lenasia South, you wouldn't believe if I told you I know the Muslim prayer off by heart. And I've never celebrated Islam, or it's never been my religion. But because I was building friends, I was within that ecosystem. I knew what Eid was, Diwali. We had all of this. We had fireworks and all of that, and I would wear, whatever, like shweshwe traditional, but I would also wear a sari. But we were in that ecosystem. The ecosystem created the access. So it's not just us in our individual capacity. If we're building ecosystems, media is an ecosystem, legislation, education, all of these things are inputs. It goes back to, what are your inputs? Your inputs get processed, and then you will get an output. And if your output is a multicultural society, you have to make intentional inputs that are creating enough cultural literacy where it's organic for people to just learn about different cultures.
And I guess if we're talking about these ecosystems that collectively we're creating through pop culture and through respect and acknowledgement of our heritage, I guess I want to end us off with a question to you, and maybe it's a comment. I know you were chatting about Ilanga earlier. That's the sun, right? And Shaya, sun shining. So I think I could have worked it out. And what I want to ask you is, in terms of how we as individuals, if we think about people who are watching this podcast from all over the world, is to ask what we can do if we are looking for this inclusion, this acknowledgement of our heritage, acknowledgement of this moment that we're in right now, where we are creating the heritage for the future. Do you have any advice for us about what we can do on an individual level to work towards that kind of beautiful picture you outlined for us?
Sure. The reason why this is actually quite difficult is because I think we ask ourselves this, even as Indigenous people, because there's this heavy sense of erasure that we are experiencing. And, to build those spaces where children learn about umemulo or whatever the case may be, from a place that isn't from an outsider's perspective, because a lot of the times when you're learning things from outsiders' perspectives, there is cultural devaluation attached to that. But when you learn from the people who honor this, whether it is, umemulo, or maybe it is, initiations of certain kinds, not all kinds, of certain kinds, that can be maybe modified in a way that is conducive to the modern world, or whatever the case may be. But it's difficult to access the essence of these institutions. But for me, one thing about cultural literacy or competency, especially in the diversity space, is where you do find that space where you can have access, and that access can be in in very interesting spaces. You can go to a church in, let's say, Dobsonville, and yes, that church will teach you about Christianity, etc., but it will also teach you about how that space sees community. It will teach you about different languages. It will teach you about different ways of life. So more than anything, it is exposure. One thing that's very important, I think, in the world of diversity, we talk about empathy, which is great, but in order for your empathy to be mature, you need range. And range can only be developed through exposure. So it's just that sense of being intentional with exposure. And this is not just about culture, it's with disability, it's with queerness. It's like when you have a space where you can go and people have control of their narrative within that space, go there with the full intention of learning on those people's terms. And it will be so enriching to develop that range within yourself as an individual. I think it's a competency that I think is even needed for the leaders that are going to build what tomorrow is, because the world is adapting. But so I think just in our individual capacity, it's finding places where we can go. And if you can't go, read, watch films. Like that's why culture is there. And when I talk about culture, I'm talking about fashion, film, all of that. Whatever people have documented, if you cannot find the physical space, find the cultural mediums where people have tried to tell their stories. It's a form of access where you learn on people's own terms what their story is.
I think just a comment on that range, I couldn't agree more. I think that sometimes when we don't know, we get so bogged down with fear, that
Mm.
we think we need to be qualified to enter into certain spaces, so to engage with certain content, so it's easier to look
Mm.
away. And I think just having that
Mm.
curiosity, to have the range and open heart and willingness to learn, such an important point that you've made
Mm.
there for an individual, on an
Mm.
individual level. So thank you so much for
Mm.
that. I'm so obsessed with you, but anyway, we won't go there because we're out of time. Thank you so much, Thando. Thank you so much for joining us. It was absolutely amazing having
Thank
you,
you.
and you've just dropped so many insightful nuggets. So, with that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much to our listeners. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. Shout out again to Kantar and crew for collaborating with us on this special edition. We hope that you subscribe to Colorful Podcast on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. We're desperately trying to grow our YouTube following, so please give us a follow. Please rate us, comment, and share with your communities so that we keep the conversation going. Until next time, bye.